Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Cut Rate Commander, the series in which we take a look at low-price commanders and make budget decks with them. My name is Grazzet, and today we'll be looking at the land-eating ooze, Slogurk the Overslime. Before we continue, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this content and would like me to continue making more videos like this in the future. And if you're feeling particularly generous, feel free to buy me a coffee in the link in the description to keep me caffeinated as we work on these builds. Also, be sure to stick around until the end of the video to see what commanders you can vote for an upcoming episode. So with that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the commander and playstyle. Slogurk the Overslime is a 3/3 ooze with trample that costs 1 a green and a blue with the following abilities. Whenever a land is put into your graveyard from anywhere, put a +1/+1 counter on Slogurk the Overslime. Remove 3 +1/+1 counters from Slogurk, return it to its owner's hand. When Slogurk leaves the battlefield, return up to 3 target land cards from your graveyard to your hand. Immediately, we can see that Slogurk is packing a mid-size CMC and stat line, a relevant keyword to help it get through for damage, and a set of interesting abilities focused around getting our lands into and out of our graveyards. Its first ability is its most straightforward, making the Overslime bigger every time a land ends up in our graveyard. Regardless of whether that land's destroyed, discarded, or milled, Slogurk will get a +1/+1 counter for each one that's sent to our bin, adding to its bulk and, alongside its built-in trample, ensuring to get in for some big damage. Its second ability then adds a measure of protection to it, allowing us to bring our commander back to hand at instant speed to dodge wipes, targeted removal, or any other effects that would have our commander end up back in the command zone and accrue commander tax. Then we get to its last ability, which has it recur lands from our grave every time it leaves the field. So if our commander dies, is bounced back to hand by its own or any other effect, flickered, etc., we'll be getting 3 of our lands back from our graveyard every time this occurs, making our commander a potent and repeatable source of land recursion. So as we've come to expect from Simic commanders, Slogurk certainly has lands on the mind, but unlike its colleagues, it's more concerned about getting those lands into the graveyard, aiming to either make itself bigger and hit harder as it does so, or recur those lands for more benefits, which is exactly what this build aims to do. To ensure that Slogurk has plenty of lands in the bin to add to its mass, we'll be running various effects that will either destroy our lands on the field for various effects, run utility lands that sack themselves to use their abilities, and have ways to pitch lands from our hands for extra effects as well, ensuring that our graveyard will have a steady stream of lands going to it to make our commander bigger and bigger over time. But we can't have our commander become too gluttonous, as if we keep destroying our land base to sate its appetite, we'll quickly find ourselves with no lands to cast our spells. To help counter this, we'll be running ways to get our lands back from our grave, either allowing us to play them from the bin, returning them back to our hands, or even putting them back into play. This, alongside with controlled usage of our commander's self-bounce and ways to get additional lands into play, we can ensure that our land base will outstrip our opponents despite us tearing it down to feed our commander. But our commander won't be the only one gaining benefits from all these lands entering and leaving play, as we'll be running plenty of payoffs that will either help us go wide as our commander goes tall, or simply match its size and joining it in smashing into our opponents. But enough talk. Slogurk is getting hungry and it looks like we're fresh out of lands to feed it. Maybe our opponents would be kind enough to offer it a meal, or maybe our commander will have them for dinner instead. So now that we know a bit more about the commander and playstyle, let's start looking at the deck itself by starting with the creatures. Starting in the CMC 1 slot, we have a trio of elves with Skyshroud Ranger, Green Seeker, and Elvish Reclaimer. Skyshroud Ranger is a 1/1 that we can tap to put a land into play from our hand at sorcery speed, giving us the first of many additional land drop effects that we'll be running to replenish our lands as we blow them up to feed our commander, this one hitting the board early and costing no mana to do so. Green Seeker is another 1/1 that we can pay a green, tap, and discard a card to put a basic land from our deck into our hand, serving as a way to search up lands to make sure we hit our land drops as well as pitch lands to the bin in order to grow our commander. Elvish Reclaimer is a 1/2 that gains +2/+2 if there are 3 or more lands in our graveyard, and that lets us pay 2, tap, and sack a land to put any land from our deck into play, making it a recurable source of land destruction that lets us tutor up any land we may need, as well as getting bigger in the process. A trio of humans then joins us in the CMC 2 slot, those being Dreamscape Artist, Dodoka Gardener, and Zamone Quandrix Prodigy. Dreamscape Artist is a 1/1 that we can pay 2 and a blue, tap, discard a card, and sack a land to put 2 basic lands from our deck into play, giving us another repeatable way to destroy our lands and pitch them from our hands to grow our commander, while fetching more untapped ones to replace them. Dodoka Gardener is a flip card whose top side is a 2/1 that we can tap to put a land from our hand into play and then flips if we control 10 or more lands, turning into Dokai Weaver of Life, a 3/3 that we can pay 4 double green and tap to create an XX token whose power and toughness are equal to the number of lands we control when summoned, making them both a way to get additional lands into play and a land's matter payoff once we've reached critical land mass by pumping out big tokens turn after turn. Zamone is a 1/2 that we can pay 1 and tap to put a land from our hand into play tapped, or pay 4 and tap to draw a card, or 2 cards instead if we control 8 or more lands. being similar to the previous entry by giving us extra land drops, but giving us card advantage instead of tokens, which then gets better as we play more lands, which is exactly what this deck wants to do. The CMC 3 slot is up next, some green creatures joining its ranks with Springbloom Druid, Turntimber Sower, and Ramin-Up Excavator. Springbloom Druid is a 1/1 that, when it ETBs, has a sack of land to put 2 basic lands from our deck into play tapped, giving us another land destruction based ramp source to power up our commander. Turntimber Sower is a 3/3 that creates a 0/1 whenever 1 or more lands is put into our grave from anywhere, and lets us pay a green and sack 3 creatures to put a land from our grave back into our hand, spawning us a steady stream of blockers as well as giving us another way to recur lands if we have excess creatures or would lose them anyway due to a wipe. Ramin-Up Excavator is a 2/3 that lets us play lands from our graveyard, serving as a powerful source of value by returning any land we blow up back into play at no cost, and working particularly well with utility lands that sack themselves in order to be used over and over again. Then the latter half of this slot brings us Cosima, God of the Voyage, Eternal Witness, and Tireless Provisioner. Cosima is an MDFC whose backside, the Omen Keel, is a 3/3 artifact vehicle that costs 1 and a blue, has a crew cost of 1, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, has that player exile cards from the top of their deck equal to that damage, letting us play any land cards exiled this way so long as they remain exiled. Her front face is a 2/4, who, on our upkeep, lets us exile her, then gains a +1/+1 counter whenever we play a land, or instead returns into play and draws us cards equal to the amount of +1/+1 counters accumulated on her, which we'll be primarily playing for her front face to get some good card advantage and a big body on board after only a few land drops for maximum benefit. Eternal Witness is a 2/1 that, when it ETBs, returns any card from our grave back into our hand, giving us some very flexible recursion to bring back our creatures, spells, or lands whenever we may need them. Tireless Provisioner is a 3/2 that creates a treasure or food token whenever a land we control ETBs, providing us with some additional value from our land drops in the form of ramp and or life gain. The CMC 4 slot then gives us a trio of green creatures with Centaur Vinecrasher, World Shaper, and Timeless Witness. Centaur Vinecrasher is a 1/1 with Trample that, when it ETBs, gains +1/+1 counters equal to the number of lands in all graveyards, and lets us pay double green to return it from our grave to hand when a land enters the grave from anywhere, growing to a sizable threat that benefits from our opponents and our own land destruction, as well as being hard to permanently keep down thanks to its self-recursion. World Shaper is a 3/3 who gives us the option to mill ourselves for 3 every time it attacks, and, when it dies, returns all lands from our grave back into play tapped, serving the dual purpose of filling our graveyard further with lands from our deck as we mill ourselves to power up our commander, in addition to being a mass land reanimation source upon death to provide a huge amount of ramp and landfall triggers from our grave. Timeless Witness is a 2/1 that, when it ETBs, returns a card from our grave back to hand and has Eternalized for 5 and double green, serving the same purpose as Eternal Witness to recur any card back from our grave, but being able to do so twice thanks to Eternalize. Entering the CMC 5 slot, we have a pair of legendary creatures joining us, with Titania, Protector of Argoth, and Tetiova, Benthic Druid. Titania is a 5/3 who returns a land from our grave back into play when she ETBs, and, whenever a land we control is put into the grave from play, creates a 5/3 token, giving us another payoff for our land destruction plan in the form of creatures and some more value in the form of land reanimation as a bonus. Tetiova is a 3/3 that gains us a life and draws us a card anytime a land ETBs under our control, generating us a steady stream of card advantage and life gain as we play and recur our lands throughout the course of the game. Reaching the CMC 6 slot, we start off with some creatures that care about lands in the form of Oran Reef Hydra, Uvenvald Hydra, and Multani Yavamaya's Avatar. Oran Reef Hydra is a 5/5 trampler that gains a +1/+1 counter whenever a land ETBs under our control, or 2 +1/+1 counters instead if that land is a forest, making it a quick growing threat that can join our commander in smashing through blockers and getting to our opponent's life totals after only a few land drops. Uvenvald Hydra is a 0/0 with reach whose power and toughness are equal to the number of lands we control and, when it ETBs, puts a land from our deck into play, scaling nicely as we recur our lands, offering us some protection against flyers and tutoring up any land we may need for extra utility. Multani is another 0/0, this time with Trample and Reach, whose power and toughness is equal to the combined total of lands we have in play and in our graveyard, in addition to letting us pay 1, a green, and return 2 lands we control to their owner's hands in order to return it from our graveyard to our hand, giving us another lands equal stats creature with relevant keywords and recursion so long as we have the lands to bounce, which has the benefit of reprocking any land triggers we may have in play as we replay them. Then we end this slot with Rampaging Baloths, a 6/6 trampler who creates a 4/4 whenever a land ETBs under our control, being a huge beater itself while also flooding the board with tokens as we make our land drops for a threat that goes tall as well as wide. Closing in on the end now, the CMC 7 slot brings us its 2 entries with Beanstalk Giant and Molimo Marrow Sorcerer. Beanstalk Giant is a star whose power and toughness is equal to the number of lands we have in play, and can be played for its adventure cost for 2 and a green to put a basic land from our deck into play, giving us a cheap ramp source early and a huge beater later to take advantage of our land base. Molimo is another star whose stats are equal to our land count in addition to having trample, making him a good late game lands matter payoff to help us crash through blockers and close out games. Finally, we reach the CMC 8 slot and our last creature with Jadzi, Oracle of Arcavios, a MDFC whose backside, Journey to the Oracle, is a sorcery that costs 2 and double green, lets us put any number of lands from our hand into play, and then lets us discard a card to return itself back into our hand if we control 8+ lands. Her front face is a 5/5 that lets us discard a card to return her to our hand, and, whenever we play or copy an instant or sorcery, lets us reveal a top card of our library, letting us cast it for 1 if it's an on-land card, or putting it into play if it's a land. Making her a very flexible card to get us extra lands into play and out of our hands, possessing a powerful ability to cheat cards into play, and being able to protect herself from removal and wipes for the low cost of a single card. All of which makes her a very powerful top-end threat for us. That covers all our creatures, so let's move on to our instants. The CMC 1 slot brings us 2 entries with Crop Rotation and Read the Runes. Crop Rotation has us sack a land we control to put another one from our deck into play, giving us a good land tutoring effect to bring up any land we may need while empowering our commander as it does so. Read the Runes is an X spell that has us draw X cards, then discard or sack permanents equal to that amount, making it a good source of card advantage while sending additional land cards into our graveyard to power up our commander. The CMC 2 slot then starts us off with a trio of counterspells, those being Counterspell, Arcane Denial, and Negate, all 3 of which counter a spell, the first countering anything, the second also countering anything but having the owner of the countered spell draw 2 while we draw 1 on the next turn's upkeep, and the third only countering non-creature spells, giving us a suite of cheap disruption effects to hinder our opponent's plays. Some green removal effects then join us with Return to Nature, Wilt, and Ram Through. Return to Nature and Wilt both destroy an artifact or enchantment, the former also giving us the option to exile a card from any grave, while the latter has cycling for a green, making them both good back row removal options with extra modes for more flexibility. Ram Through has one of our creatures deal its power and damage to an opponent's creature, dealing any excess damage to its owner if our creature has trample, giving us a one-sided fight effect that can also take a chunk out of our opponent's life totals thanks to our commander and other big tramplers. Then we close out this slot with Growth Spiral and Thassa's Intervention. Growth Spiral has us draw a card, then put a land from our hand into play, providing us with another way to get additional lands on board that replaces itself with the benefit of being playable on our opponent's turns. Thassa's Intervention is an X spell that has us either look at the top X cards of our deck and put 2 of them into our hand, sending the rest to the bottom in a random order, or countering target spell unless its controller pays twice X, giving us the option to use it as card advantage or disruption as the situation calls for. The CMC 3 slot is up next, its 3 members being Harrow, Roiling Regrowth, and Beast Within. Harrow and Roiling Regrowth both have a sack of land to put 2 basic lands from our deck into play, the former putting them into play untapped while the latter does so tapped, serving as yet more land destruction based ramp to continue feeding our commander while expanding our land base. Beast Within destroys target permanent and has its controller replace it with a 3/3, giving us a staple green removal spell that deals with a wide array of permanent threats with minimal downside. The CMC 4 slot then brings us our last instant with Eureka Moment, which has us draw 2 then put a land from our hand into play, effectively being a scaled up version of Growth Spiral that generates actual card advantage in addition to the extra land drop. That covers all our instants, so let's move on to our sorceries. Skipping to the CMC 2 slot, we start off with some ramp in the form of Rampant Growth and Farseek, both of which put a land into play from our deck, the first fetching us a basic, while the second is limited to non-forests with a basic land type, both of which keep our mana base growing nicely even as we tear it down to feed our commander. More ramp then joins us with Explore and Broken Bond, both of which allow us to put an additional land into play, the former drawing us a card and the latter destroying an artifact or enchantment, each getting our lands back into play quicker as we recur them, while either replacing themselves or serving as removal respectively. Then we end this slot with Nylea's Intervention, an X spell that either searches our deck for X lands and puts them into our hand, or instead deals twice X damage to all creatures with flying, serving as either a scalable land tutor to fetch up utility lands or a board wipe to deal with flyers that can get over our defenses. The CMC 3 slot then gives us even more ramp with Cultivate and Kodama's Reach, both searching our deck for 2 basic lands and putting one into play tapped and sending the other to our hand, giving us some more staple land ramp to ensure that our land count remains high. Then closing out this slot we have Compulsive Research, which has us draw 3 cards and discard 2, or 1 card instead if we discard a land, providing us with both card advantage and land discarding to further our game plan. Moving on to the CMC 4 slot, we have its 2 members with Splendid Reclamation and Whelming Wave. Splendid Reclamation returns all lands from our graveyard back into play tapped, giving us yet another mass land reanimation effect for a huge amount of mana and ETB landfall triggers once it resolves. Whelming Wave returns all creatures back to their owner's hands except for Krakens, Leviathans, Octopi, and Serpent creatures, making it a wipe that can clear out most board states, in addition to allowing us to bounce back our commander for extra land recursion. The CMC5 slot then brings us its single entry with Urban Evolution, which has us draw 3 cards and lets us put an additional land into play, adding more card advantage and ramp to our build, which we'll gladly run. Finally, the CMC6 slot brings us our last sorcery with Walk the Aeons, which has target player take an extra turn and has buyback by sacking 3 islands, giving us an extra turn spell that we can easily get back by destroying our own lands, which is something we want to do anyway, and with some additional ways to get lands into play can potentially get us back-to-back turns alongside our commander. That's it for our sorceries, so let's move on to our enchantments. Moving straight into the CMC2 slot, we have its 2 entrants with Druid class and Excavation. Druid class, at level 1, gains us a life whenever we put a land into play. At level 2, which costs 2 and a green, lets us put an additional land into play per turn. And at level 3, which costs 4 and a green, creates a token whose power and toughness is equal to the number of lands we control, giving us a whole host of effects that care about lands by helping us stay alive, getting more lands into play, and later smashing face with them. Excavation lets any player pay 1 and sack a land to draw a card, providing us with a very cheap means of destroying our own lands for value, which our opponents are very unlikely to use, unless they're in a desperate need for cards. The CMC3 slot then gives us a pair of green entrants with Retreat to Kazandu and a Eula's Influence. Retreat to Kazandu either puts a +1/+1 counter on target creature or gains us 2 life whenever a land ETBs under our control, either making our creatures bigger or topping off our life totals as we continue to play and recur our lands. Eula's Influence lets us discard a land to create a 2/2 token, enabling us to pitch excess lands at no cost to both simultaneously generate board presence and empower our commander. The CMC4 slot is up next, its single entrance being Court of Bounty, which, when it ETBs, makes us the Monarch, and, on our upkeep, lets us put a land into play, or a creature instead if we're the Monarch, generating us card advantage from the Monarch, extra land drops from its effect, and occasionally even letting us cheat our bigger creatures into play for free if we can hold on to the crown, all of its effects pushing forward our game plan nicely. The CMC5 slot then brings us our last pair of enchantments with Zendikar Royal and the Mending of Dominaria. Zendikar Royal creates a 2/2 whenever a land ETBs under our control, producing a steady stream of bodies to flood the board as we ramp, play lands, and recur them from our graveyard. The Mending of Dominaria is a saga whose first 2 chapters mill us for 2, then return a creature from our grave back to our hand, and whose last chapter returns all lands from our grave back into play, then shuffles our graveyard into our deck, starting off as a potential land dumping and creature recursion source, while ending as another mass land reanimation effect to bring all our used up lands back to be used up again. That covers all our enchantments, so let's move on to our artifacts. Starting us off in the CMC0 slot, we have Zuran Orb, which lets us sack a land to gain 2 life, giving us a free land sack outlet to proc our commander as much as we have lands to spare while topping off our life totals in the process. Skipping to the CMC2 slot, we have Blackblade Reforged, an equipment that equips for 7, or 3 instead if the target is legendary, and gives the equipped creature +1/+1 for each land we control, which is capable of turning our commander into a one-shotting machine thanks to its innate counter production and large amount of lands we have in play. Skipping again to the CMC4 slot, we have our last artifact with Seer's Sundial, which lets us pay 2 whenever a land ETBs under our control to draw a card, producing some steady and reliable card advantage thanks to our land-focused playstyle. That covers our artifacts, and since we have no planeswalkers in this build, let's skip straight to the land base. Starting off with our mana lands, we have Command Tower, which taps for any color in our commander's color identity, Yavimaya Coast, which taps for a colorless or either of our colors if we take a damage, Vine Glimmer Snarl, which comes into play tapped unless we reveal a forest or island and taps for either of our colors, Temple of Mystery, which comes into play tapped, taps for either of our colors and scries 1 when it ETBs, and finally Rimewood Falls, which comes into play tapped, taps for either of our colors and counts as both an island and a forest. Then we have some mana lands that sack themselves, proccing our commander in the process, starting with Bent Panorama and Warped Landscape, both of which tap for a colorless and we can tap and sack to put a basic land from our deck into play tapped, the former costing 1 and being limited to islands and forests, while the latter costs 2 and can fetch any basic. Blighted Woodland and Myriad Landscape also tap for colorless, but they can be tapped and sacked to put 2 basic lands into play instead, the first costing 3 and a green to do this, while the latter only costs 2 but comes into play tapped and is limited to fetching 2 of the same basic land type. Then we close these lands out with Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, both of which we can tap and sack to put a basic land from our deck into play tapped. For utility lands, we'll start off with Memorial to Genius and Cryptic Caves, both of which we can tap and sack for card advantage, the former costing 4 and a blue to draw 2 while coming into play tapped and tapping for a blue, while the latter draws us 1 for a colorless but can only be activated if we control 5 or more lands in addition to tapping for a colorless, giving us a pair of self-sacking draw sources that we can recur with our commander with ease. Then we have Ghost Quarter and Teutonic Edge, both of which tap for a colorless and we can tap and sack to destroy target land. The first costing nothing but having the owner of the destroyed land replace it with a basic from their deck, while the second costs 1, hits only non-basics, and can only be used if our opponent controls at least 4 lands, both serving as good ways to snipe out our opponent's utility lands. Some graveyard hate then joins us with Scavenger Grounds, which taps for a colorless and we can pay 2, tap it and sack it to exile all cards from all players' graveyards, which hoses graveyard-based strategies and we can sit on until we can recur most of our lands back in order to lessen its impact on us. Then we come to our last utility land with Lotus Field, which is hexproof, comes into play tapped, has a sack 2 other lands when it ETBs, and taps for 3 mana of any color, giving us a hard to interact with land that procs our commander twice on its own, possibly even 3 times in conjunction with our land-based destruction fetches to bring our commander online immediately. Lastly, we're running 9 islands and 12 forests as our basics to fill out our land base. So now that we've covered all the cards in the deck, let's take a look at this deck's breakdown. This deck currently has 25 creatures including the commander, 14 instants, 12 sorceries, 7 enchantments, 3 artifacts, 0 planeswalkers, and 39 lands. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 21 sources of self-land destruction, 5 sources of land to discard, 11 sources of additional land drops, 9 cards that care about land drops, 4 cards that care about land destruction, 8 cards that care about lands in play, and 8 cards that can get us our lands back from our graveyard, giving us a decent number of ways to get our lands into our graveyard to reliably grow our commander, multiple ways to get them back from the graveyard and get them back into play quickly, and a suite of effects that care about lands existing, entering, and leaving play to gain maximum benefit from all our land manipulation. For general deck stats, we have 25 ramp sources, 14 card draw sources, 11 targeted removal sources, and 2 board wipes, running a much higher amount of ramp and slightly higher amount of draw than normal to replenish our lands as we destroy them, while having a relatively normal amount of removal and wipes. Looking at our mana curve, we have 1 0-drop, 5 1-drops, 19 2-drops, 15 3-drops, 8 4-drops, 5 5-drops, 5 6-drops, 2 7-drops, and 1 8-drop, leaving us a pretty aggressive curve that enables us to get our commander out quickly and begin growing them in the early game, while still having some late game threats to take advantage of our massive land base and help push for lethal. Currently, this deck is valued at $64.66, not counting the price of basic lands or shipping. This price was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. For some side grades, there's a few other utility lands that may warrant consideration. Blast Zone, Emergence Zone, and Command Beacon, for example, all give us additional flexibility in the form of removal, flash speed casting, and commander tax evasion respectively. More land matter cards would also be good, such as Courser of Krufix and Augur of Autumn, both of which allow us to play lands from the top of our deck and offer us extra utility in the form of life gain and potential top deck creature casting. For some upgrades, Fabled Passage, Strip Mine, and Wasteland are all good self-sacrificing lands to either fetch up lands or destroy our opponents. Azusa Lostplus Seeking, Asai Tyrant of Gyre Strait, and Oracle of Moldiah are all creatures that give us additional land drops with some additional utility, while Exploration and Burgeoning are enchantments that do the same and are a bit harder for our opponents to interact with. Constant Mists, Sylvan Safekeeper, and Scapeshift all give us additional ways to destroy our own lands for benefits, while Life from the Loam, Ancient Green Warden, and Crucible of Worlds all let us get our lands back from our grave easily. Finally, any of the fetches such as Windswept Heath, Verdant Catacombs, and Misty Rainforest would be great additions to keep pulling lands out of our deck, which we can then recur again and again, making them powerful and expensive additions to our deck, while making us realize that these are not the types of land investments our parents suggested we make when we were older. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. Firstly, I'd like to thank all of my subscribers, as this channel has cracked its 1500 sub milestone, and it could not have been done without all of your support. Thank you all, and I hope you continue to support this channel in the future. Looking at the result of last week's poll, it looks like Lind, Cheerful Tormentor, was able to claim the top spot, so look forward to being cursed next week. Moving on to this week's poll, we'll be going back to the main set with a brand new selection of human commanders, those being Dennick, Pious Apprentice, Rem Carolus, Stalwart Slayer, and Vadric Astral Archmage. Please cast your vote in the community tab, link in the description, and let me know in the comments who you voted for and which commanders from Midnight Hunt you'd like to see in a future poll. Before we wrap up, again, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't done so already. And if you feel like showing your thanks by keeping me caffeinated while I make these videos, feel free to buy me a coffee at the link in the description. Also, feel free to check out the deck text floating around my head if you want to see the latest builds, or click on the link above for the playlist of all the Cut Rate Commander episodes I've made so far. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.